All right, I think we'll get started here. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our third seminar and actually our final seminar as well. This one is titled, is looking at strategies for enhancing responsive feeding in early learning programs, and will be facilitated by Dr. Misty Rossiter from the University of Prince Edward Island, as well as Dr. Jessie-Lee McIsaac from MSVU Halifax. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging the land that we're on here in Halifax. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And also, I would like to give a little bit of context to who we are at the Early Childhood Collaborative Research Center. So I'm Sarah Morris. I'm the project coordinator for this seminar series. The research and evaluation projects that we do at the Early Childhood Collaborative Research Center are led by Dr. Jessie-Lee McIsaac, who's the Assistant Professor and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Early Childhood Diversity and Transitions. Our work at the Early Childhood Collaborative Research Center engages families as well as partners in policy and practice and research and evaluation to enhance early childhood well-being. And you can see our three pillars or objectives of the center, which are leveraging family voice, knowledge mobilization, and population level evaluation. This seminar series focuses on sharing knowledge and facilitating collaborations among those working in early childhood. Please feel free, if you're a social media user, to tag us at any of the below mentions here. So we have Facebook and Twitter. You can also find us, you can find our website if you would like to see the recording of this presentation after the fact. So before we begin and I introduce you to our facilitators this evening, I'm just going to do a little bit of virtual housekeeping. Oh, someone is saying that all they can see is a black screen. Can we confirm that we can see the slides or no? Is anyone else just seeing? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. Okay. Can see the slides, no slides. Some people can and some people can't. If you're having trouble seeing the slides, I'm getting a lot of yes, so that's good. I'm not sure why some people may not be able to see the slides, but we'll look into this for you as we continue along here. Thank you for letting me know. So yeah, before we begin, I'm going to do a little bit of virtual housekeeping here. There is a mute, unmute button that looks like a little microphone on your screen. Depending on what kind of technology you're using, the microphone will be on the top right of your screen or along the bottom. You can turn off your camera by clicking the button that looks like a video camera. And that should be beside your microphone button as well. If you need to communicate with myself or Lakin, who is helping to support technology for this presentation, then you can click in the chat function there. That looks like a little speech bubble. It's also beside the hand up emoji in the top or middle of your screen. To adjust your audio, camera, and mic settings, you can go to the device settings, which is the ... on the top or middle of your screen, and you should be able to find the device settings there to play around with that. So now I have the pleasure of introducing you to our lovely presenters this evening, Dr. Misty Rossiter, who's an associate professor in the Department of Applied Human Sciences at the University of Prince Edward Island, and she's also a registered dietitian. And we have Dr. Jessie-Lee McIsaac, who's the Assistant Professor and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Early Childhood Diversity and Transitions with the Faculty of Education and Department of Child and Youth Study at Mount St. Vincent University. So without further ado, oh, actually, I'll do the agenda here. Or no, am I? Oh, yes, I'll do the agenda here. So the importance of responsive feeding in early childhood will be the first topic that our presenters will cover. Moving on to current practices in early learning environments and key strategies for enhancing responsive feeding. Then we'll move into some breakout room discussions and come back for a whole group discussion. And then we'll have our wrap up.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jessie-Lee McIsaac, and I'll be beginning the presentation today, followed by my colleague, Dr. Misty Rossiter. So just first, thank you all for being here this evening. We really appreciate you taking the time tonight to share in a conversation about responsive feeding and early learning programs. Misty and I are really excited to have the conversation with you, and we hope that as well as in the presentation, during the discussion groups, you have the opportunity to engage in conversation with colleagues, with new colleagues and old colleagues, and to engage a conversation around how we might be able to move forward in enhancing strategies for responsive feeding. So before we get into kind of the strategies that Dr. Rossiter is going to share, I'm going to provide some context for the discussion about what is responsive feeding and what does it mean and what does the research tell us. So first, just to start with a definition and the why. Why are we talking about responsive feeding and what is it? So we know that creating healthy food environments for young children is important in fostering healthy behaviors to provide a foundation for lifelong health. Responsive feeding helps to encourage self-regulation in children by allowing children to communicate fingers of hunger and fullness, and it is followed by an appropriate response from the caregiver. So the focus in responsive feeding is to provide a wide exposure of foods to children through the action of caregivers that creates a safe and supportive environment for children to explore foods without the pressure to eat more or less of certain foods. Responsive feeding includes supportive language that removes pressure and focuses on mindfulness while eating. It also considers the important connection between caregivers and children and models expected behaviors. Move to the next slide there. So maybe some of you have heard about the division of responsibility when it comes to responsive eating, which is a term that has been championed by Ellen Sauter, and the website is at the bottom of the screen. So the division of responsibility is about the key responsibilities of feeding and looks at the caregiver's responsibility, so the educator or parents, and the child's responsibilities. So it breaks down what we as adults are responsible for and what a child is responsible for. And sometimes we don't think about that when we're working with young children, but really acknowledging and supporting the autonomy of children and developing that independence. So the caregiver is responsible in thinking about the division of responsibility by providing a variety of foods, providing lots of exposure to new foods. So they're responsible for the what, setting the menu, determining what is available during a feeding time. They're also responsible for the when, so when food is offered. So in childcare centers, oftentimes schedules are set, so that tends to be somewhat determined, but really focusing on those meals and snack times and focusing eating during those times, rather than providing food at random times throughout the day. So creating that predictability, which we know in working with young children is so important in supporting behavior and just modeling expectations for what's to come. We know that's really important with young kids. Caregivers are also responsible for the where, so where food will be consumed. So oftentimes, and this is likely expected, and certainly in early learning programs, you see it, people are around a table, all enjoying food together. Sometimes at home, that might become a little bit different, but also in childcare centers, perhaps the where becomes more difficult if the physical space does not allow people to sit with one another. But the where is something that a caregiver is really responsible for in the division of responsibility. The child's responsibilities, however, is to basically come to the table or come to where the food is provided, the where, the when, the what is, and really taking in what's provided, and to decide if they're going to eat, so if and how much they're going to eat. So the child is responsible for following their hunger and fullness cues and deciding if and how much they want to eat. And although that sounds really simple, certainly maybe some of you can understand that it sometimes can be really difficult to give away that control to a child to determine whether or not they would like to eat. But really setting those boundaries, the caregiver providing the boundaries around the what, the when, and the where, and the child always determining if and how much they want to eat, really sets a foundation for, again, developing that independence in children and providing some boundaries in terms of what's to be expected for the food environment. So why is responsive feeding so important? So the why of why we're all here together and why we're talking about responsive feeding is that we know that there are both short-term and long-term impacts of a responsive feeding environment. So the short-term impact, so using this approach, helps to, as I said, encourage eating in a competent manner, really encouraging attentiveness to hunger and fullness cues, so really being mindful during the in the feeding process. It also strengthens self-efficacy, so the confidence of a child. It strengthens their self-regulation, and also can support social and emotional development as well. The long-term impacts research has also demonstrated is that it fosters healthy eating habits and growth throughout the early childhood period and can continue on in school age and longer. It also develops and fosters a healthy relationship with food. So having conversations about food, and Dr. Rossiter will get into this later, not labeling foods as good and bad, but having conversations about food in a positive manner really helps to foster a more positive relationship. It also, because we're encouraging self-regulation, helps to reduce child under or overnutrition. So some of you may know this, but recently in Canada, there has been a revision to our national food guidance that demonstrates a real alignment with responsive feeding. So those of us in this world, I think we're really excited to see the emphasis in our national food guide on healthy eating behaviors. So not just the what, not just the types of food that are provided, which of course are very important to nutrition, but also focusing on the how. How do we eat with one another? So the expanded focus really looks at being mindful. So thinking about our hunger and satiety, checking in. So encouraging children to check in with their bellies and doing that ourselves as well. Cooking more often. So that translates with early childhood to involving children in food preparation. Enjoying food. So really celebrating, enjoying being around the table with others is a really important thing to foster overall healthy eating practices. And of course, that last one is eating, not only enjoying food by yourself, but also eating with others is really important. So the changes in the revision were based on a review of evidence that considered both scientific considerations that looked at the linkage between food, nutrients, and health, while also considering how we eat in Canada, health status, and the environment in which we all live. So the changes that were made to the food guide were done in an attempt to be less prescriptive. So many of you probably remember the past food guide with food groups. So there's actually an emphasis less on how many servings and just more what your plate looks like, which you can see up there on the slide. And it really, as I said, focuses on the how we eat and encourages flexibility in how we go about doing this. So as well as our national food guidance for food, we also have in early learning programs jurisdictions that have developed standards, nutrition standards, or nutrition guidelines that guide what types of foods are provided. And oftentimes they also provide support for responsive feeding practices. They vary in terms of what they look like, but there are often some guidelines around how the food should be provided in these settings. So as an example, knowing that everyone on this webinar is from Nova Scotia, but as an example, in Nova Scotia in 2011, we had standards that were developed, and these include directives and guidelines. So directives are the have-tos, and the guidelines are this would be sort of a good thing to do as well. Important to note that this was 10 years ago, and it's similar in Nova Scotia as well as many other guidelines across the country. Many have not been updated since the revision to the food guide. I think many revisions are underway. But certainly, I'm hoping what we'll see in the updated guidelines that reflect Canada's food guide is that a greater emphasis on responsive feeding and the practices that we can implement to encourage that supportive food environment for children. So next slide. So Dr. Rossiter actually led research looking at the implementation of the Nova Scotia standards, and she also replicated that work in Prince Edward Island. Many of you may have heard of this work if you're in either province. And what her research has found is that certain responsive feeding practices, seem to be more challenging for childcare providers to implement. And we're going to get into the why that might be, and some strategies to overcome those challenges coming up. So some of the things that providers reported feeling difficulty with were providing meals family style. So family style, sitting around the table. It often means children serving themselves, which sometimes can be difficult to implement in a childcare environment. And also using language that really encourages responsiveness to hunger and satiety. So satiety is another word for fullness. So really checking in with kids' bellies to see how they're doing, if they're hungry, if they need some of the food more food that's provided, and if they're full, and really respecting that cue of fullness. Some of the other things that Dr. Rossiter found was in relation to parents. So many parents supported the idea of guidelines for nutrition and hoped that these guidelines would help support the development of a healthy relationship with food. At the same time, however, families did also describe some practices around pressuring children to eat, so not necessarily respecting that fullness cue, and also the topic of food rewards. So this is often, we still see it in a lot of places, and we know that it's not the best way to encourage that implicit motivation, right? So we know a reliance on extrinsic rewards with children, although in the short term might seem to work, in the long term they don't encourage that inwardness motivation to allow children to accomplish whatever task is at hand. And food is often brought forward as a reward for behavior. So that's something that was reported as still happening, and a challenge for families. Families didn't really know what else to do, as it does have that short-term outcome. You see the reward right away, but research certainly does suggest that it doesn't necessarily work in the long term. So moving on, as well as Dr. Rossiter's work a couple years ago, her and I have partnered 2 years ago now. So in 2019, we launched a survey across Nova Scotia to look at what was happening. So we had funding from Research Nova Scotia, and we really wanted to get a sense of what was happening to inform our future research direction. We're really interested, both Dr. Rossiter and I, in finding ways to support early learning programs to build capacity to enable responsive feeding to occur. So we want to find ways, strategies to help to support caregivers to do the important work of providing that supportive environment for young children. So some of the things that we reported and that we found in our research, and we've shared this out on social media, and it's available on our website as well, that again, there's that challenge of not knowing what to say when it comes to checking in with hunger and satiety cues. And, speaking as a parent and someone who's worked with young children, it's tough. To really kind of give away again that responsibility of an adult feeling like they know how much their child needs to eat. So it's a very tough thing, but it's really an essential part of responsive feeding is really allowing and trusting that child to respond to their own internal hunger cues. So that was one thing that people were still struggling with here in Nova Scotia, and I think that probably still exists now. Many in childcare centers reported sitting down with children during meal and snack times. However, fewer consumed the same food. So we know that modeling is really important, and certainly some practical constraints may get in the way of consuming the same foods, but even a small serving of what's available to the children can really help to demonstrate and to foster that modeling. Some of the other things that we found through this survey was that many caregivers commented on the challenges of involving children in food preparation. And certainly that can be tough with the logistics of doing it. Sometimes, there are cooks that are responsible for food in a childcare, and, engaging children might not be a straightforward way of doing that. But there certainly can be ways that we can engage and expose children to food and provide opportunities for them to be involved in food preparation or setting the table. And Dr. Rossiter is going to speak more about this later. So getting into my last couple slides before I hand it onto the practical bit. So apologies for the busyness of this slide, but I really wanted to demonstrate the complexity, the difficulty of doing this. This is not straightforward work. Creating a responsive feeding environment is influenced by so many things. And this figure really tries to demonstrate the complexity of this. So this Venn diagram is called an ecological model, and it demonstrates the spheres of influence that impact a child at the middle. So we have the child at the center, which is often how we speak in early childhood, and we have all the other things that are around them. So we often think about the immediate environment, which is the microsystems, that first sphere around the child. And we often think about where the children spend time, like their home and childcare. And of course, these are very important. But beneath even just those settings and the environments are our own, so the caregiver's own values and experiences with food that have been influenced by our own early experiences, such as those when we were kids. Further, the capacity of a family is not just dependent upon, the home independent of anything else. There's lots of other things that influence a family's capacity to provide a supportive feeding environment. Things like food security, so being able to provide healthy food, to afford healthy food, it can be really difficult. So food costs are a really important thing that you can see crosses other spheres of influence. So broader influences at the macro system. So bigger things that are beyond that a family can control. Other things like employment and income as well. So when we think of if it's a single parent or a dual income parent household, there are lots of things happening, at the dinner time that can make it challenging to provide that supportive environment. Then if we look at the childcare or a school environment, we have certainly educators and peers, but there are also bigger things that are beyond the control of educators and the people within a childcare environment. Things like funding for early learning have an impact on what an educator could do. Things like the workforce, and also aspects to training and professional development. So how the access to professional development that educators can have in healthy eating, for example. So all of these things really demonstrate, although we think it's, parents and childcare providers, set the tone, there are all these other things that they have to contend with, which are really important to think about and consider when we're trying to do our job. So broader to that is the exosystem, which is kind of at that level of looking at things like the Canada's Food Guide, nutrition standards and guidelines for childcare. And then again, broader to that are things like the social norms and values. So we know it is difficult sometimes to find healthy foods, and the healthy choice is not always the easy choice. So there's a real normalized, there's been changes over time that have made it more difficult to access healthy foods. We know that energy-dense foods are easy to access in our busy lives, and then food may not be always prioritized. And that's something that exists at that macro system that trickles down and influences our job as caregivers and ultimately children's nutrition. And then finally, at the chronosystem levels, this is the broadest influence. These are things like historical trends over time. So things like changes to food systems. So the greater prevalence, for example, of convenience foods, that has shifted how we do food in homes and in childcare centers. So these are really important shifts that have changed how we as caregivers, again, do our job and how that impacts children's nutrition. And then finally, a really big impact that we're all experiencing now is this pandemic. This pandemic has shifted how we, in our homes, have food. We may have less time to be in a grocery store. There may be less access to the fresh foods or just foods in general because of the limits to space in grocery stores, or also just being able to actually get somewhere because of the difficulties in transportation during COVID. Similarly, COVID also, from what we've heard, has impacted how childcare centers are doing their job. So I've heard some things, and you probably have great examples. I'm hoping you'll share them during your discussion about the ways in which COVID has shifted mealtime in the childcare environment. And all of these things are really important. So the key message from this really busy slide and from my excitement of talking about all the spheres of influence is that there is a lot that can influence a child's nutrition. And it's important for us to think about all these influences when we're doing our work and working with others, such as families, within the context of the boundaries that we're all encountering, and working toward the same goal, which I feel, and in responsive feeding, we talk about not just what children are eating, so healthy eating, so nutrition overall, sort of the The what, the nutrients, all those things are really important. Not just that, however, but healthy eating habits, fostering those healthy eating habits that can carry on, developing positive relationships with food, and supporting greater healthy growth and development. So my very final slide before I pass it on to Dr. Rossiter is talking about our next steps for research. So we're, as I mentioned, Dr. Rossiter and I are really interested in building capacity of educators. So we actually have a funded project through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which we will be launching next year. And we'll be starting to recruit educators in the fall of 2021, where we're going to be using a coaching model to support childcare centers and educators and develop individualized action plans that enhance responsive feeding. So action plans will really be focused on the individual context and uniqueness of the center, while also trying to consider the barriers that are really upfront of the centers that are specific to them, to the center themselves and the educator themselves. So this is our next step, and we're looking forward to telling you more about this. So then next, I'm just going to pass along to Dr. Rossiter, who's going to get into some of the practicalities and some recommendations for how we can move forward with this important work.
Great, thanks, Jessie-Lee. So I'm going to go through some of the strategies. I'm going to highlight 5 strategies specifically for enhancing responsive feeding environments in the early years. And they kind of boil down to respecting fullness cues, allowing for time to explore new foods, celebrating all foods, role modeling, and then finishing up with the food environment. So the first one, respecting fullness. We know that children are born with the ability to recognize hunger and satiety, as well as the capacity to self-regulate their intake of food. So over time, it can be more difficult for children to pick up on these types of signals. And that's due to a lot of the things that Dr. McIsaac just talked about, so the abundance of food in our society, the different smells that we have going down the street, commercials that are encouraging us to eat all different kinds of foods. And then again, this notion that, maybe a meal isn't done until it's gone. So until the plate is finished, that's when the meal is actually done. So for all of these different reasons, over time, it can be difficult for children to kind of remember or recognize their hunger and satiety signals. So these cues may often need to be, children might need to be reminded of these kinds of cues, so verbally cued to their hunger and the satiety. And these kinds of cues do help with the capacity to self-regulate. And while we know that, parents and caregivers and educators can override young children's internal cues of hunger and fullness by doing things like controlling their food intake, pressuring children to eat, or using food to reward and encourage behavior. So to unpack it a little bit, I'm just going to highlight the pressure to eat and using food as a reward. So the pressure to eat, what we're referring to are the harmless, like the 1 more bites, oh, just 3 more bites, you're almost done, finish your food, or you're not leaving the table until you eat your peas or a certain food. So all these different kinds of their cues and they're pressuring cues. And we often refer to them as sort of external cues or external factors that would encourage a child to eat that's maybe not related to respecting that hunger and satiety. Internal cues, on the other hand, focus on the feeling of hunger and fullness, and they're not used maybe as much as we would hope. So in the little talk bubbles there, we've got sort of, it's lunchtime here, take a sandwich would be an external cue. You're going to eat, I'm asking you to take a sandwich, and because it's lunchtime. So flipping that to be a potential internal cue, maybe you might say, it's lunchtime, are you hungry? Another one that we see all the time is you're a good eater, or look at you, you finished your whole plate, like what a good boy. So this sort of encouragement and tying the fact that you've completed your meal to your goodness. On the other hand, we could flip it and just sort of as an observation, like, wow, you're hungry today. You're really hungry today. And another common one is eat all of your food so you get big muscles or you grow big and strong. And again, it's so well intended and seemingly harmless phrases, but really not, those are factors that aren't necessarily related to respecting hunger and fullness. So something counter to that might be just a simplistic, are you full? Checking in with your belly, is your belly full? Foods to reward or encourage could look like, the eat your broccoli or you don't get dessert. So, eat this, if this, then this. If you eat this food, then you get this kind of a food. Or again, more external, you played so nicely on the playground. Here's a sucker for sharing your toys. So there could be some cues here that maybe would flip it a little bit, to be, rather than eat all your broccoli or you don't get a certain food, maybe you want to talk about, I hear you telling me you don't like broccoli yet, or you can choose to eat any of the foods that are offered during this mealtime. Or you played so nicely on the playground, here's a sticker for sharing your toys. It really, again, they seem seemingly small, but, and it's not the one, here's a sticker for sharing your toys, or here's a Smartie for going to the potty. The one-offs aren't necessarily the focus, but it's over time, the sort of consistent moving away from, focusing on factors that are related more to that self-regulation of their food intake. And so while often well-intended, things like pressuring children to eat or offering a reward for a certain kind of food can actually have a negative effect on a child liking that individual food item. And in the longer term, we see that sometimes it can create a positive association with that kind of a food, often a food reward or a treat, as well as the potential for unhealthy, overindulgent eating behaviors. Okay, so the first strategy was respecting fullness. The second one is allowing time to explore new foods. So we know picky eating is common in early childhood. We see it start to emerge just after age 1. So, we see it start to emerge from that sort of 1 to 3 age range, or 4, 5, or 6, depending on the child. But picky eating really is just a sign of proper growth and development. We know picky eating is normal and it's developmentally appropriate. As children age and as they sort of come into that toddlerhood, they become more autonomous, and they certainly have no problem sort of exerting or letting us know about their preferences or things that they like or they don't like. This can feel concerning, especially for parents or caregivers. And I think it might stem from, during that infancy, children tend to be fairly welcoming to all different kinds of foods. And so you may have a parent who has gone from, their child is having avocado in their scrambled eggs, and they are having pureed lentils, and they loved the squash soup, to all of a sudden they don't like any of those foods. And just as you were starting to feel really good about all the nutrients and the variety of foods that you were providing, and the breadth of foods that children were eating, all of a sudden they sort of become pickier, or they may develop what we refer to as like a neophobia, or a fear of new foods, or food jags, where they only want to eat a certain amount of foods. And again, that feels alarming, especially for an infant who may have been a very good eater, or what we perceive to be a good eater, and then all of a sudden it's pulling back. So oftentimes it's out of that a bit of a fear, and again, well intended, you start feeling concerned, and we start seeing those pressuring tactics perhaps come back. But it's important, and again, just letting parents know that it's okay to take a step back, and maybe it's the importance of trusting that child's autonomy during that stage of exerting their preferences. Counter to that, and what we can do while that time is, while we're moving through this time of perhaps picky eating, is letting food be fun. So especially around new foods, children are just learning. They might need time with new or unfamiliar foods, or textures as well. So oftentimes infants are going from a specific or a consistent texture to and then all of a sudden they're having all different kinds of textures and new foods. And because we perhaps eat them regularly, or it's so common and familiar to us, we don't necessarily remember all the time that this could be new or could be scary, and so the child is learning. Another important point with the sort of unfamiliar or the new foods is the repeated exposures. It's absolutely critical to have that repeated exposure, and what a preference perhaps that wasn't today, if there's a food that they don't like today, they might like it next week or next month, or after those repeated exposures. So literature tells us that you could have up to 20 exposures before a child starts to even consider a food, or perhaps even start liking a particular food. Educators are experts in child development, and so they know this the best. Children learn through playing, and so development with food preference is absolutely no difference. Allowing that sort of discovery through food and that play through food helps to build trust. And so allowing time for kids to be curious about foods, certainly through their play and through their activities, but also at the mealtime table as well. So a few possible cues, maybe you notice a child not eating, and rather than encouraging them or pressuring them to eat, maybe you just want to talk about, you don't have to eat those carrot coins on your plate. You want to roll them. So maybe they start, with their hands, they start rolling the carrot coin and getting familiar with, what does that feel like and what's the temperature and what's the texture. Another example, why don't you put the chickpeas on a toothpick? So if a child is sort of, poking at a certain food or, seems to be a bit reluctant, they don't need to put it in their mouth, or they don't have to, absolutely don't have to eat it. But what if we just touch it? What if we smell it? See what do they think about the smell? Or if they put it on a toothpick, they can see how that feels as it gets inserted. Other things like lining up chicken pieces, which one is longer? This watermelon feels squishy in my hands. So children become familiar with foods and textures, and they can build confidence again and trust without the pressure, knowing that they don't have that pressure to eat the food or even taste it at that time if they don't want. The next strategy we're going to talk about is celebrating all foods. So we know food to be absolutely essential for nourishment. There are a certain set of nutrients that little bodies need in order to maximize their genetic potential. But we also know that food is used to celebrate and to come together. And so nutrition guidelines and standards for childcare centers really highlight this through, talking about food being used as a symbol of community and kinship. And while oftentimes in childcare menus are set and they follow that strict criteria, or certainly within the guidance of Canada's Food Guide. But we also know that sometimes food is brought from home, and sometimes food gets certainly just talked about. So just a note here that we really do want to celebrate all foods, and that all foods can fit, and just having a little bit of caution around how we talk about or perceive certain foods. We really want to encourage people from moving away from the good foods. These are only good foods and these are only bad foods, and for a number of reasons. So there could be, if we're talking about, vilifying a food and talking about junk food or trash food, or these are bad foods for us. But if a child likes that kind of food, then, they may start to internalize, that I like that food, am I bad? That's a bad food, am I bad? Another thing to consider is perhaps that junk food or that trash food that we're talking about is the only food that that child is exposed to at home, or the only food that they have at home. And then counter to that, lots of times forbidden foods or food, a lot of rules and strict sort of rules around food, or talking very negatively about a certain food, forbidden foods become more desirable. So if a child sort of thinks I never get that food, when they do have access to it or do get the opportunity to consume it, I want to have a lot of it. So potential cues here, if we have a little guy who brings his food into the center, and maybe you've just had a nice lesson on healthy eating, and another child might talk about, oh, that meal is all junk, or you've got all junk food in your lunch. So perhaps counter to that, we could say, all foods can fit into a healthy lifestyle somewhere. Or if there is something that's come out and there, we get the scowls or the yucks, we can talk about respecting everyone's preferences. And we can also even just, again, nudge gently the foods that we like or we don't like, they change. That changes as we grow. So that kind of message is also important to communicate as well. The main goal here really is developing a healthy relationship with food, and bringing it back to the joy of eating. Okay, role modeling is the next strategy we want to talk about. And we know role modeling is a powerful tool for shaping behavior. So we see this in every area, and certainly food and feeding is no different. So seeing educators and their peers sit with children and eat the same food has a huge impact, a very high impact on what that child will eat or consider to eat. But it's also a chance for role models to talk about food as well, and talking about food with no expectation, again, that they eat the food or, they're feeling like someone's wanting them to consume a certain amount, but just sparking interest, curiosity, and having neutral conversations about food. So potential cues here could be, carrots are crunchy. Which carrot makes the loudest crunch? Or these grapes are so juicy today. Do you think the green grapes are juicier or the red ones? So here a child feels like, you know what, I can be part of the conversation. If I'm squishing them in my hands, I still see how much juice is coming out, or, they feel like they can be involved without having to, have the pressure of trying something or consuming it at all. So while mealtime is an opportunity for, conversations about food, we also know that it's used to observe, positive things in children's lives. So observing table etiquette, communication, and maybe even empathy. Other cues that could come up around meal times, Johnny, can you pass me that spoon, please? Or, oops, you spilled your milk, let's clean that up together. Or my favorite, what's the best part of your day so far? So again, mealtimes are an opportunity to relate to food, but also a chance to work on social connection as well as emotional regulation. All right, the last strategy I want to talk about is just more generally the food environment. So here we highlight family style serving, and this is where children serve themselves from a common dish. So they scoop their own serving of a particular portion, and they pour their own milk. And while it seems really lovely, it can often be messy, or there's a lot of challenges or barriers that can come up with family style serving. So we see perhaps issues with food safety, or even from a budget perspective, how much food is actually getting to a particular dish or being wasted. Those are some of the concerns, and certainly more recently, COVID. There are challenges around children feeding themselves, and so that's understandable. But it is one of the best practices that we have, and it really does reinforce autonomy in children. So allowing the child to decide how much they. The next one is allowing children to contribute to the meal. So letting them sort of help in the kitchen and contribute to the meal helps to build interest in food, as well as those lifelong food skills that we would love to see in children. Different centers have different capacity for this as well. So, some centers, there may be an opportunity for children either to rotate in or to help out in the kitchen around meal times. And in other centers, that's not sort of realistic at the time. So things like, baking activities still count, or is there an opportunity for a garden this year, or even having children sort of stir things at the table or set the table or clear the dishes. Again, all of those help to build that interest in those foods. Predictable meal times is the last part of the food environment that I'd like to chat about. Children who know or can predict when their next meal time or their opportunity for food is really feel comfortable to make decisions on that current food offering. So for example, it's morning snack, maybe it's an open snack, and I know that lunch is coming in a short period of time. So I can decide if I want a lot of food right now or just a little bit of food, or maybe I don't want any food at all, knowing that food is coming again in a short period of time. So expectations need to be clearly communicated around, what is offered and when. So if it is open snack, that's great, but we, making sure that children understand, this is the food time and it's from say 10 to 10:30. And if you want food during this time, now is the time. So when it's over, it's over. But again, as children get to understand and predict the next meal is coming, then they can make decisions around that. And those kinds of that predictability really helps to facilitate appetite and allow hunger. So those are the 5 key strategies we wanted to share with you this evening. So respecting fullness, allowing time to explore new or unfamiliar foods, celebrating all different kinds of foods, talking about the impact of role modeling, and then the power of the food environment as well. Just in my last few slides, as a bit of a conclusion or a reflection, I wanted to just share with you, what do we think what are children learning through their feeding experiences? So are they learning to trust their body, to trust their caregiver? Are they learning that feeding is pleasurable and enjoyable? Are they learning that they have autonomy over their body? Or are they perhaps learning that, someone else is in control of their body? And are they allowed to say no? Or perhaps are they learning that they have no choice in what happens? So we're just sort of moving in a bit of a shift. So shifting our thinking a little bit, and this stems from working with parents and educators and childcare providers over the last few years, a shift in thinking, and really a lot of the stories that we hear around some of the struggles and challenges around mealtime and getting children to eat. And again, all of that sort of worry and that stress around mealtime coming from an important or a good place, but moving from get to let. So what we hear caregivers saying is, how do I get her to eat? Or I can't figure out how to get him to drink more. Or his mom said we need to get 24 ounces of milk in him. I just can't get her to sit at the table. So shifting this get to more responsive, in the spirit of responsive feeding, language that could be used is, I need to let her decide how much to eat. I will let him choose from the food that's available. Let them be curious about food, and then let them trust their own decisions at meal times. So how does let feel? There is this sense of permission from the child. Much of the struggle around feeding really does stem from a child's their need or their desire for autonomy. So they want to feel in control of their own body. While this can be difficult sometimes to transition to, so relinquishing that power or that control, so allowing children to retain their own control can really drastically change meal times as well as the food environment. So facilitating appetite and allowing hunger, creating boundaries around meal times, around what's offered and when, and then respecting children's food choices during that time. Reducing the pressure and truly enjoying meals together. So responsive feeding practices help to build that healthy relationship with food, as well as to provide confidence to make the choices around eating that will help to promote self-regulation, as well as lifelong healthy development. Thanks very much. Sarah, is this back to you, or do you want me to finish?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. McIsaac and Dr. Rossiter, for this fantastic presentation and for sharing all this great information with us. This presentation will be, I will share it out with all of you, and the recording of today's session will be available on our website.